can start now.
Good evening. This is Ilia State University discussion on the topic of Russian-Georgian War of 2008, the war which started on this day 12 years ago. My name is Gigga Zedania, and I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished panelists, Professor Roy Ellison, Professor Stephen Jones, and Professor Rronald Suni, and hopefully Professor Robert will be joining us shortly. Thank you very much, dear colleagues, for being with us today. To anybody who is interested in the history and politics of the post-Soviet region, these names are very well known and in some cases even legendary. To those who are not familiar with them, I will introduce each of our speakers individually a bit later. Let me say a couple of words about the immediate context of this discussion, which is the new program in modern Georgian history, recently established at our university. We regard it as the opportunity to start a dialogue about our recent past, considering it as part of the history of the region. And the August War of 2008 seemed to us a worthy topic to kick off these discussions, which we very much hope to continue in person, so physically in physical presence, once the COVID-19 threat is over. 12 years have passed since the start of the war between Russia and Georgia. The first book written about it was called The War That Shook the World. And despite of its many merits, the title turned out to be a bit misleading. So this was the war which precisely did not shake the world, although we in Georgia strongly believed it should have. The reason for this was that there has been a firm opinion in this country that the War of August was not primarily about Georgia, but about much more, meaning that Russia in its imagination was fighting not so much with Georgia, but in Georgia with the West. So responding to the perceived threat of NATO approaching its borders or retaliating against Western recognition of Kosovo, etc., etc. So the second revolution in Ukraine and its aftermath provided us both with passive and active scenarios of responding to the Russian threat. I mean, the Crimea on the one hand and Donetsk and Lugansk on the other. We also saw that Russia has not limited its interest to its so-called near abroad and post-Soviet countries, but got recently involved in Syria and Libya as well. We have been in all seriousness discussing the possibility of the Russian meddling in the UK referendum and the US presidential elections. So could we not consider all these events as a process of which the August War was a serious premonition? So 12 years after the war, unsurprisingly, Russia still does not comply with the 2008 ceasefire agreement, remains on the Georgian territory, having increased its military presence, having recognized both Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states, having integrated them into the Russian state structures. Apart from this, the occupation line is constantly moving deeper into the Georgian territory, the so-called borderization process. And civilian population is being systematically harassed. There are, as you know, numerous cases of kidnappings and killings of the local civilian population. So in this panel, we will discuss the 2008 war itself, the causes that led to it, and the context in which it occurred. But I also hope that we will touch upon the prospect of somehow remedying the situation if it is a possibility in the foreseeable future. And I'm extremely glad to welcome Roy Ellison as our first panelist. Roy is a professor at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies. He's an expert of international relations, foreign and security policies of Russia and Eurasia, and our longtime friend who has contributed significantly to the interest in Georgian studies at the University of Oxford in the recent years. He is also the person who has researched both security and legal implications of the Russian-Georgian War and published several in-depth studies. So starting this panel with Roy Ellison has some substantial as well as alphabetical kind of reasons. So Roy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this kind introduction. So I see the purpose of this panel as to assess the conflict and its consequences with what we know a dozen years later. So it's a reflection back with the hindsight we have now. So what does the current perspective tell us about some of the major uncertain questions posed at the time and soon after the conflict? I'll focus on international aspects, just touching upon Russian motivations and evolving Russian policy, on Georgia's strategic situation, implications for other CIS and post-Soviet states, and perhaps a little on consequences for regional and international order. I think my colleagues will consider the historical background more and how the domestic scene in Georgia fed into the conflict. And I take up the story from the point when Russia committed itself to send large-scale forces into high-intensity combat in Georgia. So the first question I'll take is, how did the conflict change the overarching Russian policy towards Georgia and approach to security policy in the South Caucasus? So this is a very big question. And I would say that earlier in the 1990s and earlier in the 2000s even, there was a tendency in Russia to look for some ways to engage with what was happening south of the main Caucasus mountain range in Georgia, in order to manage perceived security problems in the north. So that is the problems of succession and conflict within the North Caucasus required some measure of engagement. And this one associates also with the former Prime Minister Primakov, for example, in the late 1990s, and also the ways in which Russia engaged with some coercive elements, of course, with President Shevardnadze. This, I think, changed significantly. After the conflict, Russia had forward deployed forces south of the main Caucasus line, which were built up in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and was in an adversarial relationship with Georgia proper. This hasn't essentially changed, but it has meant that Georgia itself, of course, in many senses is much more vulnerable politically and in security policy terms. There were worries in Georgia at the time and later that Russia might take this further. I mean, for example, we were aware that the Russian military were unhappy that they didn't have land access to the bases they had in Armenia, and they could have demanded transit rights or something like that. Well, I say, fortunately, that hasn't happened anyway. I mean, so far, that aspect has been managed, despite the reference by Rector Zedania to the borderization policy. Secondly, second question, how should we evaluate the military aspects of Russia's campaign and its effects on Russian military policy? Well, it seems that once the main forces were launched, there was a clear commitment by Russia to degrade Georgian military forces significantly and to the extent that they could. And this was done rather systematically, and obviously this went beyond the military requirements just to regain control of South Ossetia. That wasn't accomplished fully. I think Georgia managed to retain many of its forces. And there was a question about really how far to move into Georgia itself. This is a rather vague area, but my reading of it is that the Russian military itself were keen on advancing, systematically advancing as far as Tbilisi. Their view is that once a military campaign is begun, it should be prosecuted to the end, and it shouldn't be restrained by political considerations. Here, it may have been important that the president in Moscow, the former president, was Medvedev, who was more hesitant on this, aware of the wider international implications. And so there was this gradual advancement. And there may have well been a hope that there would have been some kind of political turmoil in Tbilisi, which would have unseated Saakashvili, but that didn't happen, of course. There may also have been a hope that by cutting off the main strategic highway and routes in Georgia, that the economic consequences and the pressure on the leadership in Georgia might also have led to changes, but that didn't happen either. It would have required time. So effectively, a ceasefire line was agreed. the effects on the Russian military, well, there's been quite a lot of discussion on this. The Russian military clearly did not perform very well, given the size of this military apparatus. And the Georgian military, in some respects, did rather well. This led to quite a lot of soul searching within the Russian high command. And you could argue that it really sparked off finally a serious effort at military reform within Russia itself, which beforehand had been very half-hearted. There hadn't really been funding behind it. And it led to the growth of that military apparatus, which we now see, 12 years later as a much more formidable organization altogether. The other military aspect to note, of course, is the agreements that were reached with South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So and these were progressive. By autumn 2016, Russia had signed an agreement to develop joint military forces and a Russian military base, along with motorized Abkhaz infantry battalions and artillery aviation groups. And it gave the Russian Defense Ministry command over the forces in war. So I would regard that arrangement as something like one of a military protectorate. Gali was declared a military town with special restrictions on travel. And there was also an agreement to integrate the units of the armed forces, so-called armed forces of South Ossetia into the structure of Russian military. And this creates something which is termed a common defense space. So this kind of integration with the forces in those areas has really changed, really quite basically structurally, the security situation in the South Caucasus, and it seems unlikely to change. Third question I'd like to just touch on is, and this is controversial, during the war, did Russia seek a change in the Georgian political leadership? We still don't have any clear evidence of Russian thinking on this matter. And so it's all rather indirect. But obviously, Putin had a very strong animus against President Saakashvili and would have dearly wished him to go at the time, but had to accept this was not practicable. I think that already within a couple of years, it mattered rather less, because Saakashvili had developed quite a strong alignment with President Yushchenko in Ukraine. And when he was replaced by Yanukovych, it was more difficult for Saakashvili really to sort of project himself in that part of the CIS, or to be able to get his voice heard in the same way. But this was something effectively the Russian leadership had to swallow. Next question is, when was the Russian decision to recognize South Ossetia and Abkhazia as states taken? This interests me. I think it was taken really it wasn't taken in advance. It was taken during the course of this conflict. I suspect it was not in fact, I'm fairly sure it was not a decision that was approved by the Russian Foreign Ministry, but the Russian Foreign Ministry, of course, isn't a decision maker. It probably was not seen as very desirable by President Medvedev, and it could well have been much more a Putin decision, without thinking through the implications of this fully. Because if we consider how this has been received, I think we have to view this as a failure on the Russian behalf, a real failure to woo states over to recognition. Even states, of course, among CIS partners, close partners like Belarus, have still consistently refused to recognize either South Ossetia or Abkhazia. And I think this is because there were real concerns about what this did and process that led in this direction. Russia had effectively empowered separatism. It had used newly created Russian citizens instrumentally in statecraft, and it had put forward a variety of arguments about succession. Effectively, in legal terms, there was an argument about remedial succession, which were not viewed as desirable at all by other CIS states with minorities on their territories, nor were they viewed favorably by large neighboring powers with minorities such as Turkey or Iran or China. It was really very challenging to do that. And so it's not surprising, therefore, this has remained a failure in Russian policy. There was no support for recognition, for example, in the Collective Security Treaty Organization when it met, or indeed in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And it's been left as a difference that Russia has with these states. And I think this also reflects on the whole question about how far the campaign influenced cohesion and integration among CIS states. Now, one can argue this one way and another because the example of the Russian use of military force could have had an intimidating effect. But on the other hand, the way it was used, as I said, to support separatist states was something alarming to post-Soviet leaderships. And overall, I would say that this increased suspicions about Russia as a state ready to use military power in its vicinity. And that it influenced and affected neighboring states, neighboring CIS states, much more than states further afield in the West, for example. The final question I'll just raise is, what were the implications particularly for Ukraine and its foreign policy trajectory? Here I'll remind that actually at the time of the conflict, the rhetoric that was flowing from Russia to Ukraine was really quite extreme. Ukraine was really being cast as an adversary in this conflict, almost as a belligerent. There were claims that Ukrainians were manning surface-to-air missile sites in Georgia and the like, which was not the case. And one almost felt that it could have at the time spilled over in some way into some clash with Ukraine. But of course, the election of President Yanukovych some while afterwards tempered those kind of Russian policy concerns, and indeed many of its strategic concerns on Ukraine for a while, certainly in 2014. But I wonder rather whether the Crimea template that we saw in 2014 wasn't first began to be developed there by the General Staff as early as 2008. Not with a necessarily a clear scenario when it will be used or whether it would be used, but that some of the parallels between these two conflicts began, or between these two states as problematic for Russia began to develop in the thinking of the Russian General Staff. And here one may note there are also similarities in the way that in 2008, the Russian embassy in Simferopol was handing out passports, making Russian citizens, and this whole issue of passportization, which has become quite controversial politically and in terms of international law since that time. So I think I'll leave it there and look forward to my colleagues' comments.
Thank you very much, Roy, for this very insightful remarks. And now, next speaker is Stephen Jones. Just a couple of words about him. Professor at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts and the foremost authority on the questions of Georgian history. Among the publications, I should mention his two monographs, Socialism in Georgian Colors and the Political History of Georgia Since Independence. And the Georgian translation of the first, I'm very glad to say, was brought out by our university in Georgia. And I'm very glad to say that Stevens also became affiliated with Ilyas University recently and will be involved in developing the modern history program I mentioned earlier. So if somebody is able to provide us with a historical context in which to consider this August War, it is definitely Stephen Jones, and I'm glad to give him the floor now.
Okay, Giga, thank you very much for organizing it and bringing us all together. Very great pleasure for me to be alongside Roy and to Ron and discussing this issue. You know, I would first like to say, express my sympathy for all the innocent people who suffered in this war, because like all wars, these victims were mostly those who had no interest in starting the war. So we, as a result of the war, we're talking about 850 dead and on both sides, and about 130,000 people forced to abandon their homes. In my view, this was a contrived war, like most wars. It was planned, according to Russian insiders like Andrei Illarionov, a former Putin advisor, and Pavel Felgenhaya, a military expert. It was planned far in advance of August 2008. And Putin himself admitted later on that the planning actually began in 2006. So, but in the broader context of 18 years of conflict and provocation between Georgia, South Ossetia, and Russia, it does not really matter who fired the first shot. According to Pavel Felgenhaya, this war was going to happen whatever the Georgians did. So by 2008, in Putin's mind, this was no longer just a war against Georgia. It was a war against NATO and the West more generally, and a warning to former Soviet republics about the limitations of their autonomy. For Russia, this was not an ethnic conflict, but a strategic one. And for Georgia, this was not just a Georgian South Ossetian struggle, but was part of a much broader conflict over sovereignty, democracy, and Georgia's relationship with Western states. Having said that, this war was a result of multiple failures on all sides. Conflictual relations between Georgians and South Ossetians are not restricted to Soviet and post-Soviet periods. There were violent George-Ossetian conflicts harmful to the Georgian state before the Soviet Union was even heard of. The First Republic in 1918 to 21 also had serious problems integrating Ossetians into Georgian society. The most crucial security issue for Georgian governments in the 20th and the 21st century has not been the threat of external force so much as internal conflicts between majorities and minorities. The inability of Georgian governments to provide real opportunities for economic and political equality and self-government for South Ossetians is part of the problem. Poverty and educational marginality in the 1990s accentuated the South Ossetians' isolation. The resentments this caused in the 1990s, particularly in the Gamsakhudia period, led to violence that the Georgian government failed to prevent. It led to the state's internal fragmentation and the opportunity for Russia to claim it was meddling in Georgia's domestic affairs to protect the rights of national minorities. This is precisely what happened in February of 1921, when Soviet Russia ended Georgian independence. The difference was that in 2008, Russia argued international law was on its side and that they were enforcing the UN principle of R2P, or the responsibility to protect, in this case, the South Ossetians. The 2008 war also demonstrated, despite Saakashvili's massive military spending on Georgia's armed forces before 2008, that Georgian military power will never be sufficient to protect the country against an aggressive Russian neighbor. It was a delusion before 2008, and it remains one today. Even with all the US-supplied anti-tank Javelin missiles, there are no military solutions for Georgia. Unfortunately, with an imperial neighbor like Russia, Georgia can never be fully secure. The best security resource for Georgia is a well-integrated, multinational and democratic society with a clean government that has popular legitimacy. More transparency in the period leading up to 2008, for example, would surely have prevented many of the serious mistakes made organizing the Georgian armed forces, along with the purchase of defective military supplies from Ukraine and the Czech Republic. The other delusion in 2008 was that the West would come to Georgia's rescue. That did not happen in 1918 to 21 during the First Republic. It did not happen in 2008, and it's very unlikely to happen anytime in the future. In 1920, Georgia, the First Republic, was refused entry into the League of Nations. In April 2008, Georgia was not given MAP, or Membership Action Plan, by NATO. And Georgia is not being considered, of course, for EU membership. I can remember after the 1989 tragedy in Georgia, hearing Georgians talk of their oboli eri, or the orphaned nation, abandoned by its European neighbors. Under Saakashvili, there was a similar expectation that Europe would pay its debt to Georgia for its long isolation under Soviet power. The international response to the 2008 invasion was important. The EU brokered a ceasefire which ended further escalation. And I agree with Roy about this. We don't really know what the Russian intention was ultimately, but there's some speculation that Putin wanted to go into Tbilisi and particularly to overthrow Saakashvili. And the US clearly, in its response, provided vital aid for economic recovery for Georgia. But enforcement of the EU agreement has never really succeeded, and it's never been completed. It still isn't. Within a year of the invasion, President Obama was in Moscow negotiating a reset of US-Russian relations. The OSCE was hollowed out. The Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe was abandoned. The UN Security Council became tied up in great power vetoes once again, and the UN Charter was marginalized. If 1991 marked the end of the Cold War and ushered in an unprecedented period of multilateralism, Georgia's war in 2008 represented the beginning of what David Miliband, who's the CEO of the International Rescue Committee, calls, quote, the age of impunity. Great powers like China and Russia are now free to do what they want. They are following the example of the US in the 1990s and the 2000s, when it too acted abroad unilaterally and with impunity. The Russian invasion in 2008, I would argue, has had a significant impact on international politics, in large part because of the West's feeble response. It became a precedent for 2014 in Crimea, for Chinese seizure of islands in the South China Sea, for the murder of Kamal Khashoggi by Iran, and for the US refusal to observe international asylum laws. COVID-19 has only accelerated Western states' retreat from their own stated foreign policy values. In President Saakashvili's second inaugural speech in January 2008, 8 months before the war, he declared, quote, "We rise or fall as a nation depending on the strength and the integrity of our institutions. A strong democracy, an empowered opposition, an independent judiciary, a civilian-led military, an accountable government, and a thriving civil society." End of quote. If these aspects of the Democratic Republic of Georgia had been in place in August 2008, I would argue the war would have been much less likely. Saakashvili was right, though he did not act on his arguments. The best way for Georgia to check the arrogance of power abroad is to sustain openness and democracy at home. So there are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for this very detailed and deep analysis. And last but definitely not least, today we have Ronald Suni, professor of Michigan University, with us. Professor Suni is not only a formidable authority about the history of the Soviet Union, but what is even more interesting for us today, he is the author of foundational works on the history of the South Caucasus region, having written histories of Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and so I know that his very important book on the Georgian history is being translated right now in Georgian, so we are looking forward to it, and I'm very glad to welcome him to this panel. Professor Suni. I cannot hear your voice. You have to switch on the mic.
Okay. So thank you, Rector Zedania. This is a wonderful opportunity, and I wish it were more a celebration than a kind of retrospective remembrance of a tragic event that occurred 12 years ago. As an American, I would like to place this struggle of Georgia and Russia in a larger context of global policy, and particularly the role of Russia and America's conflict and competition that has had such dire effects on the Caucasus, the region that we're concerned with. In some ways, in a broad sense, I would argue that what we see is, and saw in Georgia in 2008, and later in Ukraine in 2014, is part of a picture of a competition between an ambitious regional hegemon, Putin's Russia, and an ambitious global hegemon, the United States. And those two things together have cost a lot for smaller nations. Russia, of course, is or sees itself as a Velika Держава, as a great power, and has tried to assert itself in a variety of ways, both through the Yeltsin years in the 1990s and more aggressively, more determinedly in the 2000s under Vladimir Putin. And Russia's ambitions have always, in their own self-understanding, been thwarted by NATO, by the European Union, by colored revolutions in their own imagination, by the United States. And from around February 2007, the time of his famous or infamous Munich Conference on Security Policy speech, Putin has changed the Russian policy from a kind of reluctant acceptance of the expansion of NATO, of America's unipolar dominance in much of the globe, to a much more determined effort to, in fact, limit this kind of global hegemony that they understand and fear so much. And he's been, in many ways, very successful. It's funny because Russia is both a very weak power and a very strong power. It's a strong power vis-a-vis its neighbors. It can do all kinds of harm and mischief when it chooses to do so in its own region, in the former Soviet space. But at the same time, vis-a-vis other powers, Europe, NATO, United States, it's quite weak. It spends less than 10% of what the United States, let alone NATO, spends on defense. So it's a very interesting paradox about what Russia can do and what Russia can't do. Putin, it must be said, first of all, has been very successful in playing a relatively weak card on the world stage. He basically drove the Americans out of Syria with the help of an incompetent, somewhat lunatic president that we have in the United States at the moment. And he tried also to do something similar in Libya. The Turks have sort of thwarted him at the present time. So in some ways, in many ways, he's done well. In others, he's done very poorly. He got himself into a jam in Ukraine. He rather precipitously annexed Crimea after the overthrow of a pro-Russian president. And now he's got both feet deep in a quagmire in eastern Ukraine, and he's isolated from much of Europe. He's suffering under sanctions, etc. So there's both a kind of pragmatism, realism about Russian policy, and at the same time, there are what I would consider colossal mistakes and grand posturing that has led to difficulties for the regime. Now, about the Georgian situation more particularly. Russia, of course, has both a strategic and a kind of historic, traditional interest and role in the South Caucasus. But Russia, first of all, is not the Soviet Union. Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan were part of a great empire, the Soviet Empire, and the flow of goods and services and dominance and power relationships had both advantages and disadvantages for the peoples of that region. Russia is not a country that's going to build subways in the South Caucasus. It's not going to treat that area as part of its own integrated economy. Rather, it's going to be rather exploitative of the region, as we can see. Look at the way it's dominated the energy sector in both Georgia and in Armenia. So it treats these countries both as foreign countries, but countries in which it thinks it should have some kind of dominance or regional hegemony, which makes it very difficult for these small nations to live together with Russia. In the Georgian case, my own view is, and there's a lot of speculation and controversy over this, is that Putin didn't want this war. That Putin and Russia were perfectly satisfied with the status quo ante before August 2008. They had basically client states or statelets in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. They had weakened Georgia. They could effectively prevent Georgia from entering NATO. There was no need to move any further. What were they going to gain from this? On the other hand, for perfectly understandable reasons, the Saakashvili government was dissatisfied with the status quo and wanted to change it. And Saakashvili had rather successfully, rather deftly managed to bring Ajaria back under Georgian control earlier, and the Russians hadn't complained about that at all. And so this war, for me, I hope this won't be too provocative, I would call Saakashvili's war. It is a war that the Georgians effectively used military might, including aerial bombing, against what they purported to be citizens of their own country, that is the people of South Ossetia. At the time, you remember, Putin was enjoying the Olympics in Beijing with Bush, and they had significantly in ways provoked the Georgians over and over again. And it's sort of like, it reminds me of the situation of Napoleon III in 1870, who was provoked effectively by Bismarck to start a war, which of course he colossally lost. And the same happened to Georgia. And then if you look at Russia's rather pragmatic policy in the war, they didn't take Tbilisi, they stopped short of that. They did a lot of destruction, etc. They took over even more firmly Abkhazia and South Ossetia, but against the wishes of many in those two little statelets, they did not annex them fully or make them part of the Russian Federation. In fact, they tried something in between. One has to consider the context. Historians are all about context of 2008. What had happened earlier in 2008? Do you remember Kosovo? Do you remember how the West had declared and established the independence of Kosovo, how what had been started as a UN effort in Kosovo was taken out of the hands of the UN, where Russia would have a veto, and put in the hands of NATO, and eventually Kosovo became independent against the norms of international law and diplomacy. So that became an important precedent for Putin and for Russia. And Putin, there are many statements of Putin in which he warns about this being a dangerous precedent, which it indeed was. The West asserted that Kosovo would be a one-time, one thing, and wouldn't become a precedent, which actually basically has turned out to be true. Most states don't want to support separatist movements and allow people to make these kind of moves unilaterally without the blessing and the agreement of the host state. So Kosovo turned out to be an unusual situation, but Russia and Putin used it very effectively in their own efforts in the Georgian territory. So where are we now, and what can be done? And is there a future for this area? It's very difficult to predict, of course, and blame, as my colleagues have mentioned, lies on both sides. No one is purely innocent here, but one has to again think pragmatically about what might Russia's, under Putin's, ambitions be. Are they in fact an imperial state that wants to reestablish some kind of Soviet empire over these areas? I doubt that. It would think of the costs to Russia of trying to control Georgia, a hostile state, or Ukraine, a hostile state at the moment. It would be far beyond their means. Putin, despite all of his adventures here and there in the world, is conscious of the costs of imperial overreach, of trying to do too much with your limited power, something I wish my own government was more aware of. The Americans, of course, are in dozens and dozens, if not 100 states in the world. They have troops and they're in all parts of the world because their ambitions are far more global than regional than the United States. I think we should see Putin as a pragmatist, as a realist, as someone who in fact has limited goals, but also, and by the way, also may be the best of the bunch in Moscow today. We might look back on the Putin era as an era, yes, of an aggressive, confident Russia, but far more limited in its ambitions than those who might replace him in the future. I think I'll stop there and we can then start the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Suni, for these very interesting remarks. Very often they are contradicted, as you could imagine, by the lived experience of Georgians on the terrain. But of course, this is a kind of possibility to discuss. And actually, I would like to start the discussion, if you allow me, with the last point made by Professor Suni, when he said that Russia most probably does not have this ambition to reconstitute the empire, because this is the fear in this country quite often, that we will become the prey or the victim of this Russian imperial expansion for the third time, right? Stephen mentioned the experience of the First Georgian Republic, and the history could be repeated. So my question, first of all, to Roy and Stephen would be, do you think that Russia has enough resources to repeat that? And do you think that international context in the coming years would allow such a kind of imperial expansion?
So a comment on this. Russia's resources as a state have increased significantly since 2008. However, Russia, of course, was strongly impacted by the global financial crisis, and then by sanctions after 2014, and now by the COVID-19 crisis. In that respect, right now, I would say that Russia has to be in a period of some kind of retrenchment in trying to limit spending and overreach for the time being. However, I mean, against that, I mean, this is really just about the practical issues and pragmatic assessments. Is what I see as a more ideological perspective that has developed. So if we're talking about the period since 2008, and you look at the, for example, at that time, the debate on, let's say, Eurasianism within the Russian political elite, what were fringe assessments, minor assessments on the side, more radical assessments have really entered the mainstream of thinking and have also started to be expressed by the political leadership itself. And really quite far-reaching claims. You look at those key speeches Putin made over Crimea. This was about historical justice, restoring historical justice as interpreted and defined on the Russian side. And those historical injustices, which are seen as open to being remedied, include a view about historic Russian lands, which is really quite worrying. I mean, more recently, there have been official remarks on how former imperial Russian lands, as well as the territories of the Soviet Union, constitute a zone of legitimate Russian influence, and this should be open to re-evaluation. Now, this is maybe just rhetoric, but on the other hand, it does influence attitudes in the elite when it's heard like this, and also in the Russian public at large. So I am concerned that there hasn't been a kind of static view about Russia's entitlements within the CIS region in the last 10 or 12 years. And just hope that, in fact, what I call a more ideological perspective that has developed will be constrained by resource limitations, and also choices will have to be made between attempts to realize that rather idealistic ambition in the CIS and the other ambition, which is to project Russia as a global power and to carve out a role in the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think those two roles together are achievable. So choices will have to be made about where Russia's priority lies. And I think for Putin, it would depend upon what really assists image, status, and as he sees legitimacy in the absence of formal electoral legitimacy.
Okay, Gigga, shall I add to that? Yeah. So I agree with Ron in the sense that, Putin is clearly a pragmatist. He understands the limitation of Russia's resources. On the other hand, Ron admits that it's a hegemonic power in Eurasia. And I think it comes down to a question of how we interpret hegemon or imperial power. What does imperialism mean? So, for example, if we define imperialism by occupying a neighboring state, then Russia, well, it's halfway there, let's say. If we interpret imperialism as the ability of a dominant power to meddle and to some degree control the domestic politics of a neighboring state without necessarily occupying that state through political and economic influence, then I would argue that Russia is still imperial in its ambitions. It clearly has significant influence and power, not just in Georgia, but in neighboring states. It has created institutions like the Eurasian Economic Union and the Collective Security Treaty, which I would argue essentially instruments for preserving Russian dominance in the region. So, my difference with Ron, I guess, would be how we define the difference between, say, a hegemonic power, which seems sort of imperial light, and imperialism. And I would argue that Russia is still imperial in its ambitions.
My my own view is that an imperial power controls both the domestic and foreign policy of its clients or whatever, right? And the hegemon is one who wants to make sure that the independent state, which is kept independent, in fact, does not threaten any of the interests of the dominant state. So it's more interested in their foreign policy. So in the Cold War years, the Soviet Union was certainly imperial over most of the East European states, but was hegemonic over, let's say, Finland, something like that. That's how I would define it. But these are semantic discussions almost, but they have important consequences, I think, because Russia is a state, and Roy talked so beautifully about its ideological shifts and its self-image, which has felt since 1991 as bitterly humiliated and exploited by the West. And of course, no one can deny what the effects of NATO expansion have been, right? Against, by the way, promises made to Gorbachev that they wouldn't move further east. So Russia's sees itself, you could say this is correct or incorrect, as a state that's quite vulnerable, right? Given the power of the United States and NATO, et cetera. And so it acts defensively in a variety of ways. And at times, I would say, makes terrible mistakes, right? They had to resist the events in South Ossetia, but they well overreacted, it seems to me, in 2014 vis-a-vis Ukraine.
If I may kind of return to one particular question of NATO, you know, that with this August war, NATO membership was at stake. And there was this paradoxical thing because, of course, before the war, there was this difference of opinion about whether to give membership action plan to Georgia and Ukraine or not. And though there were those who felt in retrospect justified by the fact of war, saying, well, Russia used the window of this indecisiveness on the side of the West to attack the aspirant country. On the other hand, the war did not change the mind of those who were against granting this membership action plan because they argued that exactly something like that, which they feared, materialized with the August war of 2008. So how could you say how each of you estimate the chances of Georgia becoming a NATO member in the near future? You know, perhaps that there is a very strong consensus inside Georgia about the NATO membership. According to the last polls, around 70% of the population supports the NATO membership. But do you think that in the foreseeable future or in the coming years, there will be a window of opportunity to access NATO for Georgia? So, Roy, if I could start with you again.
So I don't think that Georgia would have been offered the membership action plan anyway, because of the opposition of major European NATO states, particularly France and Germany. Their concern was precisely because of the state of South Ossetia and Abkhazia and frictions, and did not wish to import this into NATO. Whether Russia believed this or not is another matter. It may have come to the view that, well, when a decision is taken in Washington, that drives the outcome and other NATO countries just come around to agree to it. But I don't think it probably would have happened. I think in current circumstances, you still have perhaps even more countries, but certainly those major NATO states, rather on this matter, rather conservative players who would just oppose this. I mean, meanwhile, what NATO has done is it's taken the emphasis a bit away from this. There was this membership action plan as a kind of holy grail on the way to membership. And there've been a variety of other different partnerships and structures and so on, which Georgia has been able to access to continue the cooperation and forms of integration and this is and to give a sense of being part of that community beyond the partnership for peace. So this goes quite a long way, but of course it doesn't provide that security guarantee that Georgia seeks. There has been some discussion about the idea of Georgia entering NATO, but the territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, those as states recognized by Russia, being outside the zone, really, if you like, of that association. In practice, I think this doesn't really get around the problem, but it's rather similar to an argument, for example, that Finland could have become could be a neutral country even with a Soviet base on it until 1956, because the zone of the base could be seen as outside, territorially outside the neutral territory. And these kind of arguments, I think in practice, diplomats will still look at what is happening there. And it's not as if the situation around South Ossetia and Abkhazia is stable now anyway. As we know, there is this concern about the border creeping, changes, tensions, and that can be turned on and turned off quite easily. So I think that I don't think this is a real prospect. There is one other option, though, that was always there, and I'm surprised that Russia did not take that more seriously, and that is a direct bilateral security guarantee from Washington. I mean, as a state outside NATO, it's perfectly capable of having direct treaty arrangements and agreements on a bilateral basis with other states. And the risk of that emerging through frustration in Washington that the NATO option wasn't being offered was something that I'm surprised Russia didn't take more seriously. As it turned out, of course, under Obama, that wasn't seriously considered. And under the current Trump administration, that isn't seriously considered. But certainly the United States could step up bilateral security arrangements and arms transfers and so forth outside the NATO structure. And that shouldn't be forgotten.
So if I could add to Roy, that was very interesting. I agree with Roy that the chances of Georgia joining NATO are practically zero. NATO in itself is a very complex multinational organization, multi-state organization, and to get agreement, particularly with the reluctance of France and Germany, the major powers along with the US in NATO, to resist complicated situations like the South Caucasus. Even if NATO did accept Georgia, I'm not sure what it would give Georgia. I mean, I think it's got what it needs by being this sort of associate member of NATO right now. NATO brings all sorts of things. It brings military training, modern warfare techniques. It brings also an element of democracy to countries in the sense that one of the requirements of NATO is that your Minister of Defense should be a civilian. I mean, so there are important aspects of NATO which Georgia has definitely benefited from, quite clearly. But the question always is, well, if it came to a situation in which NATO was considering resistance to Russia militarily, would it do it? I mean, even the Baltic republics are very concerned about what the commitment of NATO would be should there be a military incursion by Russia. So, this whole faith on NATO, and I'm drawing on my own thinking about the First Republic, during the First Republic, the Georgian leaders were totally focused on getting Western support, Western aid. They wanted to be members of the League of Nations because they thought there would be protection if they got into the League of Nations. I think that these are still major questions. I think what Georgia does have, and Roy touched on this, is it's this sort of substantial package, if you like, that NATO has given Georgia. It's a very special relationship with Georgia. And, this is maybe the model of the future. Maybe Georgia is the model of the future for NATO, which does not wish to have new members, but it will have substantial links and cooperation with other countries like Georgia, but not actually grant them membership. And I think that's probably the future for Georgia.
Some years ago, I was listening to a lecture by the then Georgian foreign minister at Stanford University, and he was very vehement and confident that Georgia could both be a member of NATO and retrieve Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which seemed to me incredibly contradictory, right? That Russia, of course, would somehow concede these two little statelets and also allow Georgia to be part of NATO. So what's important for Georgia? It seems to me that Georgia's first concern should be reintegration of those parts of the historic Georgian homeland which it's lost, right? That would be an incredible achievement. But what would that entail? That would entail not being a member of NATO, unless NATO somehow miraculously changed into like a collective security agreement rather than an anti-Russian alliance, right? Remember that NATO didn't really know what it was going to do after the fall of the Soviet Union. It scuttled about trying to find some purpose, and then they found it again, resurrecting the anti-Russian thing. There was even talk at one point of bringing Russia into NATO in some way, but all of that sort of fell apart. So unless NATO were something like a collective security agreement and keeping all its members from fighting each other, Turks not killing Greeks and Frenchmen not again killing Germans, etc., I don't see why this would be good for Georgia to be a part of NATO. But what Georgia could do is think much more creatively about how to improve its relationships with Russia. If I'm right that Russia's pragmatic, but also has hegemonic ambitions, are there ways in which you can improve that relationship? If Russia is some kind of imperial demon set upon reconstructing something like an empire, then of course there's no future for that. So one has to change one's view of the world. One has to change, if possible, the way you conceive of Russia's ambitions if you indeed want to improve those relations, and then think about some kind of hopefully federal solution with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. There would have been an opportunity had Saakashvili, in fact, when they took back Adjaria, had shown a solution, a way of dealing with that region, maybe on some kind of federal basis, but that was not done.
And the last question, as you know, the present panel was called the Lessons of the August War, and it might be overly optimistic, this belief that you can draw some lessons from history. But if you would kind of be forced, so to say, to draw one lesson from the war, what that would be? And I would like to reverse now the order and start with Professor Suni.
Yes, I'm not sure history teaches us many lessons except all the wrong lessons, right? So we read always about Munich, and then we think the Soviet Union is Hitler's Germany or whatever. But it seems to me we can think practically or pragmatically about the situation. First of all, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, the countries I'm most concerned with, live in a dangerous neighborhood. They live between Turkey, Iran, and Russia, right? 3 countries with imperial pasts. So it's not accidental that Georgians, Armenians, and Azerbaijanis have certain visions and understandings of those empires that dominated them at one time or another through their history. It's perfectly understandable. What I'm saying is ideas of who you are and who the other is, ideas of what your national identity is and what the ambitions and national interests of another are not fixed in stone. They are, in fact, social and cultural constructions which can be changed. And unless they change, you'll be stuck. You'll be petrified into a situation of hostility with the powers around you. It seems to me Georgia as a democratic state and Armenia as a democratic state, we'll leave Azerbaijan out of a minute. It's a little bit opaque what it is. It's certainly not democratic. Those states have opportunities to think, discuss, and rethink who they are and what their interests are. That, I think, is the lesson that history might give us.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Ron. I probably disagree with Ron on this one. I think Ron is right, obviously, that Georgia has to think differently about Russia, perhaps more pragmatically, which I think it is already doing. But it's not all dependent on Georgia, of course. It's dependent on a very difficult, authoritarian, and I would call it a neo-imperial state. Ron would call it a regional hegemon, that in many cases refuses to cooperate. So, for example, any idea of, as Ron said, the priority of getting back Abkhazia and South Ossetia as part of Georgia's sovereign territory is just, while Russia is behaving the way it is, while Putin's in power, it is impossible. I can't even see a successor to Putin making any concessions on this issue. So it's, yes, of course, Georgia has to be thinking differently. It's a small state in a very difficult neighborhood. It has to be pragmatic. It has to be fluid. It has to think of different regional security structures, right? Other than just depending on the West. I agree with Ron on that. But on the other hand, Russia is, there's a long history with Russia, and it's going to be very difficult unless something actually changes in Russia too. And I'm hopeful that it will. I think Putin is in an increasingly difficult position. We've seen demonstrations, of course, in Vladivostok and so on. And there's a decline in support for Putin. I'm not sure where that's going to go. And as Ron said, it might lead to a worst case scenario. But something has to change in Russia as well as in Georgia. And I just want to say, a couple of other things. One of the real weaknesses of the First Republic and why it fell in 1921, as I mentioned in my initial speech, was, the problem of internal tensions in Georgia, in particular between Georgians and their minorities. And minorities, of course, lived on the periphery of the Georgian state. They were easily exploitable by Russia. That is one thing Georgia has to focus on, to integrate and to create a more democratic state in which national minorities are fully empowered and fully integrated. Okay, so that's one issue. The other issue why Georgia fell in 1921 was because of the lack of regional cooperation with both Azerbaijan and Armenia. They tried to create a federation in April of 1918. It failed. And thereafter, throughout 1918-21, just getting together to think about a common security or common trade, these sorts of things that would perhaps have helped sustain Georgian independence. And to be honest with you, Georgia was taking the lead on this, but it never happened. So I would like to see more emphasis on regional cooperation, real regional cooperation. I don't know how that will happen while these conflicts in Nagorno-Karabakh and elsewhere continue to these frozen conflicts, if you like. But maybe that's an emphasis. That's something that Georgia and the other states, Armenia and Azerbaijan, should be thinking about. Armenia, for example, now clearly wants to loosen the connections with Russia to some degree. I mean, obviously, it still depends on Russia, but here's an opportunity for greater Georgia-Armenian cooperation. Now, Azerbaijan, well, the crackdown in the last 2 or 3 weeks also suggests that Azerbaijan is taking advantage of, this age of impunity and is doing what it wants, doesn't care anymore. But, Georgia, as Ron says, Georgia has to be thinking differently, other than NATO, other than the West. It has to be broadening its contacts with the region, with Iran, for example, Turkey, other places, China even, So, that's it's a very interesting question, Giga, but I don't think we know the answer to that one. Yeah.
Thank you. And right, your conclusion.
So I agree there with Stephen's comments about the hope for greater regional cooperation. I think specifically on the war, I would say that Georgia has to just recognize the limitations of its own agency in influencing the security policy priorities of big powers. That was clearly the case with the United States. There was a belief that Georgia was much more significant in American thinking than it clearly was. And that was mistaken. Georgia will continue to be seen through other policy priorities, much more important policy priorities in Washington. But the same could be said also for Russia. And of course, that means that it's a bit of a qualification. How far can Georgian policy really, even with the best will, influence very much Russian security concerns and priorities in that part of the world and specifically towards Georgia? Of course, attempts can be made, but I think that since 2008, there has been, in some sense, it's been fortunate for Georgia that Russian, instead the focus of Russian policy on the Black Sea has shifted away. Now, Abkhazia really does not constitute the same hasn't got the same strategic significance. There isn't so much emphasis upon it. It has now shifted to Crimea, and in turn, Crimea is being linked up through the Black Sea with Russian involving policy in Syria, which takes the attention away. So I think for Russia, generally sort of managing relations with Georgia, keeping things as much as they are, is likely in the coming years, given its other policy priorities. But I'll end on a positive note, and that is there is a significant difference between this war and the fighting in Donbass and the aftermath there. The difference is really that all along there was an attempt, on both sides, I would say, not to present this as a war of people against people, but rather between the states and the leaderships and after this war, the attitude of Georgians towards Russians and Russians towards Georgians on the personal human level did not significantly change. Russians come to Georgia as tourists and they're welcome. Georgians in large number continue to work within Russia. And there isn't the same kind of animosity at that level that we're finding increasingly in Ukraine. In parts of Ukrainian society, an absolute now turning against Russia, a kind of separation in human terms, which is deeply concerning, thinking about long-term management of relations. So I think increasing people-to-people contacts in various ways, cultural, science links where these are possible, tourism, and so on, all would be to the good. I think that it's possible, and it will lead to, I think, to the traditional view of Georgia as actually being a state with people close to Russia, with a culture close to the Russian, indeed the Orthodox Church close to the Russian Orthodox Church. All that I think could be helpful in managing relations going ahead.
Thank you very much. Really, I would like to thank all of our panelists for their many-sided and insightful analysis of the 2008 war. And unfortunately, Professor Robert Service couldn't join us due to a technical difficulty, and we hope to engage him at some other time in the foreseeable future. And myself, not being a historian, but being a philosopher, I perhaps believe stronger, so to say, in the ideals and ideas. And I have the feeling that this double ideal of the individual rights and national sovereignty, which is very strong currently in Georgia, and which makes the kind of rapprochement with Russia almost impossible, will remain as the guiding principle of the development of our state and society. Thank you very much once again, and all the best.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.